All right. Welcome. We are back with our what I believe is our fourth. I think this is our fourth episode of the not so difficult, uncomfortable conversation. I got myself. I got my brother from another mother, At, and today we have a really special guest who has become a friend of mine over the years via his brother and my previous job. We were just talking on air about my connections to Detroit and how I'm in, and I've threw out a couple of things that I know only people from Detroit would really know if you really in or you really not. So I've gotten the stamp off. I've gotten the stamp off air from Darren. But Darren Nichols, he is an award-winning journalist coming out of Detroit, what Detroiters would call the D. And I tell you, he recently had an article this past Sunday on Father's Day. Darren, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay.
Tell about your journey, and then maybe share a little bit about what sparked that article, and then we'll take it off and run it from there.
All right, that sounds great. My name is Darren Nichols. I am a journalist for over 30 years. My love and passion was sports, but I ended up being on the news side. I have covered every mayor in Detroit since Coleman Young, so that would be 5 administrations. I covered mostly city politics. I was the person who outlined the financial crisis in Detroit that led to the bankruptcy. And then in 2014, I had a major stroke, and that took me away from my current place in journalism. And I was able to work for myself. And now that I'm working for myself, I was given the opportunity to write a column for the Detroit Free Press this past Sunday. And we talked about a number of different things that were talked about in this particular piece. One of the main pieces that we talked about was me having to tell my children how to deal with police brutality and illegal situations, or in some cases, legal situations when they get pulled over, and what they should do. And then I talked about my dad and how he influenced me in terms of the things that he did with his career, as well as the lessons that he talked to me about, and that I had to draw upon the lessons that he gave me in order to be able to talk to my children. And then from there, I talked a little bit about the need and necessity for African American men to step up and help our community, because that was what I grew up with. I grew up with a community, and by no means did I live in an impoverished situation, but even still, I wouldn't have been able to make it if it wasn't for that community of men that not only stepped in when my father was too busy, but just were always there. All these men were just always there in my life, and even as a kid, I was able to sit back in the car and listen to the conversations that they were talking about, and apply it to my life knowledge. And so that's how the story came about.
Absolutely. And your dad was a not just in Detroit, but a very well respected high school basketball coach across the state of Michigan.
Yes. What a lot of people don't know is my dad was the high school coach at Kettering High School. For you older basketball heads, his two players, Eric Money and Connell Norman, started guard U at Arizona. And from there, my dad worked under Dick Vitale as his assistant coach for 3 seasons. And he was the guy who put together, every time you hear Dick Vitale talk about the great teams at U of D, that's my father's work. He came in with his All-American and 3 other guys in his first recruiting class. And that's when he created or helped to build Dick Vitale's career. And from there, he went back to Kettering High School as the athletic director, and ultimately ran athletics for the entire school district in Detroit.
Awesome stuff. So So obviously we're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about racism.
Yes.
And it's a question I think that's kind of come up. We've had a guest now. You're our second guest. It's kind of come up. I know the answer is going to be much different for you than it was our last guest because he's white and grew up in Middle America in in
Sure.
Indiana. When was the first time someone outside of your parents? When is the first time anyone ever had a discussion with you about racism? Can you remember?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I was very fortunate to go to a school that was very multicultural. And a lot of the people that I am still friends with today were from all different races. So the conversation in my house, and I mentioned it in the story, was my dad wanted to make sure that with dealing with other races, because he knew that I had good relationships with uh, people that weren't like me, he wanted to make sure that I wasn't too trusting of people because in the weeks leading up to the 1967 riots in Detroit, there were two black uh, teenagers who ran out of gas and asked some people for some help. They invited him to their picnic and tried to give him gas and that kind of thing. And ultimately, they killed both of them at that day, on that day. And my dad always used that as um, the place where he would teach us about not trusting everyone so far. So it wasn't necessarily someone calling me the N-word or anything like that. The only time I recall being called the N-word was when I was practicing cross country one day on Detroit's east side, which is right near the border of Grosse Pointe, which is pretty much 90 some odd percent white at the time. And some kids were driving down the street and they called us the N-word. But outside of that, my dad really tried to teach us from the other aspect of it. Like, it's okay to like people of other ethnicities, but really to not always be as trusting, because the world is not like in generalities, the world is not like what you're seeing and experiencing as a young child.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask this question, because I did read the article and I thought it was a awesome piece. So definitely I want to pat you on the back for it.
Thank you.
What has been going on over the last couple of weeks, maybe even say that's months,
Sure.
and when you're black, you look at it over years.
Sure.
What pushed you in these more recent events to say, I need to have this conversation with my children? Had you already been having that conversation?
No, because I thought that they were too young to have that conversation before.
Okay.
And I delve into that issue within the piece. What do I say to my children? Are they too young to deal with this kind of stuff? Am I ready to tell them this kind of stuff? Right. And so I really wanted to introduce this issue with my children, because I know that they are sheltered. They are middle class children. And so it's a much different Black experience than living in some of the worst conditions in the city of Detroit. So I needed them to, just like my dad, I needed them to understand that this thing is out here, that Black children or Black men or Black women can be killed because of what's going on with the police and police misconduct. But really what you should do. And I am fortunate enough to be, and me and my wife are fortunate enough to be in a place where we can kind of tell our children to, listen to the cops, don't say anything. If you have to go to jail, we can bail you out of jail. And, I know the best defense attorney in town, and he would be on my phone. His mom's house was across the street from my mom's house. So I've known him my entire life. But I understand that is a luxury to have. Right? For people who live in conditions that are much different than mine, they let their frustration with the police boil over, and it runs into the 10 or 12 times that they've been harassed by police, whether they were let go or not. And people can't take it anymore, right? And so I dealt with it from that perspective. It's no secret. Every Black man that I know that's been around has had these kinds of incidents occur to them. I didn't get into it in the piece that I wrote Sunday, but I have been illegally pulled over by the Detroit police. And so I wrote a piece a couple years ago in Pittsburgh where and it dealt with the killing of Antoine Rose. And there were two things. One was I began the piece by I was living in a suburban community where the police were, I guess, called over to my house or were riding through the neighborhood, and they stopped me while I was cutting my grass. And they asked me what I was doing in the neighborhood, and I was renting a house in the neighborhood, right? So I mentioned that incident, and I had been pulled over several times in that area, to the point where after they would pull me over at a point, it got to be, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Nichols, we didn't recognize it was you." And then I also talked about in more detail about the time that I was pulled over by the Detroit police when I was 17 years old, leaving my first freshman. I was a freshman in college, leaving my first college party, and I was looking for a place to eat. And I looked over to my right and to my left because there were two restaurants that typically had stayed open at night, and the police thought that I was looking suspicious, and they illegally pulled me over, guns drawn, was put on the car, hoping that they searched the car, and I hoped that they didn't plant anything in my car to take me in, and all of that stuff. And so I use that as an example of, when you're 17 years old, you don't always make the wisest of decisions. Antoine Rose decided to run that day. I decided to listen to all of the lessons that my dad had told me, and to comply with the police, understand that, there's nothing you can do to stop them, and and to get through the incident. And as a former coach, those were some things. I coached in one of the most one of the most hardest hit areas in the city of Detroit, and I knew that my kids needed to hear these lessons. And through basketball, I always told them, don't argue with the coach. My biggest thing was to respect authority, and it didn't matter who the authority is. In basketball, it's the referee. In your classroom, it's the teacher. Whatever the teacher says, they're in charge. And I would tell them, someday in your life, there's going to be a police officer that pulls you over, and you're going to think that's bullshit. Just like you think the call that the referee just made was bullshit, right? But if you yell at a referee, you can get a tech. If you yell at a cop, you can either go to jail or lose your life. And so I used to teach all of those kinds of messages all the time.
Yeah, so, I'm just giving from a white guy's perspective. I can't even, like, the fact that you have to have a talk with your kids to say, don't say anything, even if they're wrong, is mind-blowing to me, right? And now I know it happens, even though I know it happens, and I've grown up and I've seen it happen firsthand myself. I've been riding in the car and seen it happen. It's still, like, it makes me emotional to think about that friends of mine, people who I hold very, very dear to me in all different walks of life, have to have these conversations with their kids. And I understand it.
Sure.
And it's really, it's sad that you have to say, even if you've not done anything wrong, and even if they're 100% in the wrong, don't say anything so at least you can be alive and fight against it and push back against it. And
Right.
that's wrong. That's wrong in itself that we even have to be in that time, you know, in that space in the world to even do that. You know, and man,
it's just the reality that we as African Americans, blacks, whatever, however you want to call us, or pagans, it's just the reality that we live to where we're not as emotional as you would be understanding and hearing it. It's just like a way of life. It's just like the way you breathe every day. You learn that that's just the way you breathe. You know, you figure out, you go up you jump in the water and you can't breathe good in the water. You figure out, I need to hold my nose for a couple of seconds and I come out. It's the same way with just moving around. I thought something was super interesting that you said too, Darren, because I'm hearing a lot of why did they, on this topic, why are they fussing back? Why are they resisting? And I think it was very key. We hadn't brought this up that you said that this isn't the first time.
Yeah.
It's the second time. It's like the 12th time. And
yeah,
it's that 12th time that really catch you at a bad moment where maybe you're not as in a good emotional state.
But history tells us that's what trauma does. It's a traumatic experience to go through that. And, you know,
I can tell you, you know, that, you know, my heart would always race whenever I saw a police car behind me. You know, and I know a lot of other Black people who feel the same way.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, and you know, you've had a bad day at work, or you've gotten fired, or you had a bad day with your wife or girlfriend, or whatever the case may be.
We are back. I'm Shane.
You know, it becomes an issue where you're tired and you can't take it anymore. You know, and that is, to me, the hard part in all of this for everyone to understand. And the same thing with cops. Like, cops have bad days too.
They have bad days,
right? But you know, one of the things that I used to tell my colleagues at work, you know, is just because you have a bad day at work, that doesn't mean you have to take it out on me. And it's the same thing with the police. And the one thing that I would add to the situation with the police is that I think over the last decade or so, you have heard a lot of conversation about the police being a paramilitary organization. And that really brings about a police department where you must do everything that the police says, and when you don't do what they say, it's like the army. You got to follow orders, and when you don't follow orders, that is when we take you down. That is when we see you're in a situation where you're face down on the concrete with someone's knee on your neck, and you are killed for selling loose cigarettes, and all of those kinds of things. And so, it's all those are all realities of what African Americans have to go through on a daily basis.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and Darren, we decided that we're just going to call black people, and white people.
Yeah.
So
right.
For our white listeners, I think one of the things that Black people are not saying as a whole, we're not saying that every cop is a racist, but what we are saying is that the system needs to be changed. The system needs to be reformed. And one of those reformation the system needs to do, and this is for Black cops and white cops, is to first teach them how to deal with people. People that aren't just saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, what do you want, sir, what do you want, ma'am, but to deal with people that may not look like them, that may not speak like them, that may not respond like them, and just maybe, like Darren was saying, maybe having a bad day. Because what I'm seeing is in some of these clips that are just flooding TikTok all day. I can turn on TikTok right now and I'll get 5 videos where there is an incident. And what I'm seeing is that if there was a regular person, meaning cop, step out of your badge, step out of your gun, and just be a regular person and say, you know what? Yeah, he's got a smart mouth. Yeah, he isn't going to hit me. I realize he doesn't have a gun. And what I'm asking him about, he hadn't murdered anybody, he hadn't stolen anything.
Yeah, but I mean, but
it's
it's
real
also
people.
yes, but it's also, in my estimation, a byproduct of not funding the police departments adequately. And so there used to be a time where police officers walked the neighborhood beat. So you got a chance, whether you were right or wrong, to know who the cops that were working in the precinct or in your neighborhood. Now we're in a place where the person that's pulling you over is not someone that you know. It's not someone that you've had a relationship with. It's not somebody who you've known since you were 10 or 12 years old, who came to one of your basketball games when you were 10 or 12. Now you're having interactions with people that you haven't met at all. And so it's not, I don't think it's a matter of all cops being bad. We know that we do know that there are some bad apples of the bunch. I mean, but I can say, I know plenty of Detroit police officers. I have high school teammates that are Detroit police officers, right? And so, and I would vouch for them, on any day of the week. But I also know that within the Detroit Police Department, there are still problems. So what I think the key in all of this is you have to develop a relationship with the people that live in your community so that when things go down, it is dealt with in a reasonable manner. And that doesn't mean that I am, saying be soft on people who are doing terrible things. I'm saying that if you are caught doing things that are wrong, you should go to jail. But in a lot of instances, when you have people who are being pulled over, or when you go into people's homes, or whatever the case may be, it can be done in a way that everyone is reasonable about the results.
Sure. And I think that's a big part of it is, I look, there's always fringe people, if we'll call it right or left. There's always extreme people on both ends that just kind of run with a narrative and, kind of just, say the narrative, right? Like it's, whatever. And it's the hot topic and they share it and, whatever. I don't think there's anybody of any real common sense, black, white, or any color, that believes that every cop is a bad cop, right? I don't think any of us believe that. And the sheer numbers and actuality of it is there's probably considerably more good cops than there are bad. Like that's just, we know that, right? But and this is how I look at it. If we're asking, in a lot of these scenarios I've seen, or I've had conversations with police officers and different things, it's, they shouldn't have acted that way. And maybe they shouldn't have, but if you're the professional, you should have adequate de-escalation skills to take that person from an 8 to a 4, right?
Right.
Now, if you do those things and that person is, then if you have to handle it because they just, were belligerent and just didn't, then that's, that's part of the process. And it's a tough job. I mean, let's be honest. You're out here riding around. You don't know who's got a gun. You don't know what's going on. We have no gun reform. So,
absolutely.
I saw it myself firsthand in multiple cities, in Detroit included. I've seen teenagers in the car with sawed-off shotguns. I've seen, a lot of different things, right? So I get it. I understand it. Now, I've got a unique view of the world because of my experiences and going through those things. But, I don't think there's any doubt that things have to change. It's like, I think, the first call that happens to anybody on a mental wellness check is a police officer. right?
Right.
And you know that they don't want to be out there on those calls. So that's part of that reform that has to happen of let's
Sure.
get mental health experts on salary and let's
Mhm.
let the cops take care of
Yeah.
the criminals. And because that's what happens. If that cop's had a bad day and he's been on his shift for 12 hours, 3 days straight, and he pulls up and there's someone who's mentally ill.
It's a bad day. It's
Yeah,
gonna be a bad day.
Yes.
yeah, it's if that person wasn't a police officer and was a normal person and that interaction happened, it wouldn't be pretty. Like it wouldn't like
Right.
we don't know how to handle that. So you know, and mental health is a thing. Everyone has it. We either have good or we have bad, right? And
Yep.
there's a lot of those stigmas I think that we got to get through, especially with men. And I'll tell you, Darren, there's something, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If I remember correctly, maybe over the last 10 years, there was even an initiative done by the city to where they were buying some of these really inexpensive homes that were sitting vacant, and they were
Yes.
offering those homes to cops who would come in to work. Well, now you've got a bunch of people coming in from out of town. And listen, I've experienced, I've walked and can walk in some predominantly black neighborhoods that most white guys cannot go to and feel very comfortable and feel. There were sections of Detroit where I had to get a briefing. Like we don't go out. You don't have your jewelry. You don't wear these things. Like when you go to the club, you dress down. You don't dress
Right.
up because of there's certain things that now, again, I'm with certain people. So I have a level of comfort and a level of trust
Right.
with those people. I can only imagine. I mean, let's be honest. How scary is it for a cop who's white, who comes from Eastern Kentucky, and he shows up in Detroit and he's driving through a neighborhood and all of a sudden 2 hours in, he realizes there are no white people.
Right.
And
Right.
like, that's going to be scary. Right.
Yeah.
And
What
go ahead.
I would say to that is that a part of why the city was trying to incentivize cops to come and live in Detroit neighborhoods is because they lifted a residency requirement in Detroit in 1999 throughout the entire state. And so up until 1999, all of the Detroit police officers were living within Detroit neighborhoods. Now, did they have two homes and they had one for their own address and they lived in suburban communities? You could feasibly say that was going on. But this lifted a residency requirement throughout the entire state where you could work 30 miles away from the city that you work in. And so if you lived in my house in Southfield, I could work for the Pontiac Police Department if I wanted to, or I could work for the city of Pontiac.
Yeah.
And so those were some of the things that are going on. And so I think that's what sort of changed the dynamic, at least in Michigan, of what was going on with the police.
Absolutely. So I've had a couple questions come in. I'm gonna throw out you guys' way. So one I'm gonna ask because it was asked by a black male in reference to something that AT said. So I'm not gonna chime in because I'm gonna let you guys answer this, and I think you guys will be able to. But it was about me. So
okay.
So I'm gonna put that out there. So the question was. And I'll summarize it. AT made a reference, I think, in our first episode or maybe our second episode about he realizes what I'm putting on the line as a white male speaking up publicly the way that I do or doing this. And the question was, he doesn't understand what could I be putting on the line. I have nothing to lose by doing this because I'm a white male and I'm accepted. I'm kind of paraphrasing. It was a long thing. So hopefully that adds some context. I think you guys get the gist of what he's asking. So I'm going to let you guys answer this so it doesn't just come from me and sound like it's just my opinion.
Yeah. So I think to have some type of context, you actually have to know you and kind of know your surroundings and kind of your story and what you have to deal with. But even more so than that, you just go back and look at history and how, you know, the one white person that stood on the side of right and stood on the side of righteousness and how they was just abused and how they were called. And I'm going to.
You can use them. Yeah.
I don't even know if I should use the word or not, but
you can't. No, you can't. You can't. I've been called them before, so you can't. It doesn't offend me.
Matter of fact, again, I don't know why TikTok is interesting me so much, but I heard it like this. They were protesting in Buffalo, and a guy called this, one of the white protesters this. So in understanding that when you make a stand, and not just in this racism thing, but, you know, throughout history, I mean, Jesus talked about how, you know, how people would make stands, how he would make stands. And when you're going against the majority and you're actually a part of the majority, there's typically some type of backlash and some type of pay that you have to pay. And you have to look at not long ago, and I always stay on this soapbox because you look at the Jim Crow and the laws and the civil rights movement. That really wasn't long ago, y'all. That was just,
right.
I just missed it. I was born in 74. I just missed it. But everyone I know, my mother, my father, aunts, uncle, cousin, all these folks I deal with are just a tad bit older than me. They all went through that. But you have to look at, you know, the Freedom Riders, those Freedom Riders that came from Detroit and went down to Alabama, and, you know, how some of them never made it home. So when I say, you know, there's something that you're putting on the line, you know, you're putting your reputation in community. You know, maybe there's some friends that may not be racist, but say, it ain't my problem. Why is it your problem, Shane? Why are you dealing with that? It ain't none of our problem. Let them deal with that. Look, we're not in Detroit. We're not in Atlanta. We're not in Chicago, where this is a big, we're out here. And, you know, so that was my point and where I was coming from.
Yeah. And the only thing that I would add is that we always have to remember our historical roots, and that there were always people that were white who got killed in the civil rights movement for some of the things that they did. And so they didn't necessarily have to pass out flyers and do the things and try to register Black people to vote and all of these things that they did during the civil rights movement. But that's what they felt was necessary in order to move the country to a better place. And so I would just say that there's always something on the line, but it's how you deal with them.
Yeah. Well,
and whether it's genuine or not. There are a lot of people who, you know, they want to be involved because this is the story of the day. But at the same time, you have to be genuine in your approach. And, you know, at least for me, knowing you for quite a while, I know that you're genuine in what you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate that from both of you guys. So I will add some context to it, and I think to put it for the white listeners that are listening, there are still racist white people who make decisions. There are still racist white people who run business communities. There are still racist white people who are within our government, and those things. I'm sure I'm on a list somewhere because of how much I do speak out. So when they're saying that I'm putting something on the line, essentially what I am being labeled as is in some ways as a Black person. And I'm going to be judged or looked over. Now, thankfully for me, and both of these gentlemen do both know me, I'm very much an asshole if I need to be. And I'm also very educated, and I had a couple friends reach out to me in this, like, you know, you're a racist worst nightmare, because you're a white guy who knows how to speak and you understand these things and you've had some success. So it's not like I'm just jumping on a soapbox to jump on it. And I've talked about it forever, even when when I had my previous company. You know, I take a lot of pride in knowing, because of my previous experience and knowledge and connections to Detroit, I take a lot of pride in knowing that over that time period, we helped young, and a majority of them happen to be Black, a majority of those families save over $10 million in scholarship and aid, because that money now is going back into that community. It's going back in there. And I know how valuable that is. And, you know, for me, I don't care about the backlash. I'm not concerned. 60 years ago, would it be a different story? Sure, I'd probably have to fear going to the grocery store or you know, those things, because the likelihood that someone would have an issue and I'd have to fight somebody, or I could be killed because I'm openly expressing empathy and sympathy for Black people. Absolutely. But we don't live in those times. So instead, now the chatters in group text messaging and group phone calls and, side conversations that they're having that they won't have to my face and they won't have to me. So that's really where it is. And I appreciate you guys adding that context. I didn't mean to throw it out there as in to take up for me or anything like that. I wanted the context to come from someone on the other side that understands it. So
make sure you get my check in the mail. Did I say anything you told me to say?
Well, it's the old saying, if that's what I got to do, as long as I get the invite to the barbecue, I'm good. So I'm in.
And for me, I'm like the young boys. I keep it 100 all the time.
I appreciate that. And you've both gotten to know me in different contexts. So I think I think that in itself is, I think, even, Darren reached out to me 5-6 months ago about an issue that he was dealing with race and in sports and called and wanted to get some context in my opinion. And I was humbled by that. He's writing an article, about a scenario that, but that's the thing though. And that's why I love doing this, is because I want people to see that this is a very normal conversation for me. I can have conversation about race. I can sit and have two Black guys sit and we can talk about race, and I'm not concerned that I'm going to be attacked. Yeah. I'm not going to we have to have this. We have to have it.
But race is a very nuanced conversation. It is not something that is very simple. It is not something that we all will agree with, because we all have separate circumstances that happen to us. And so if you have had different experiences than someone, that's okay. I think the issue becomes in having empathy for other people and what they are going through. If you're going to look at race, and I get that, everyone looks at race from a different prism, but when you do have that, when you do look at it from a different prism, understand that people have different experiences, and it is those experiences that lead up to some of the problems, and also understand that these problems are not new. These things started the riots in LA in 1992. These are some of these things that led up to the riots in Detroit in 1967. A lot of more than 100 cities in 1968, following the death of Martin Luther King. The Watts riots in 1965. You can go to Tulsa in 1928. You can go to Detroit in 1943. And so these things have been happening over a period of time.
And not to cut you off, Brandon, but I think that's part of the problem. Is the very large majority, or I would say nearly 80%, 90% of all of living white Americans cannot tell you details about most of what, outside of 1992, because they were alive and they saw it on TV. They can't tell you anything of the Watts riots, Tulsa. They can't tell you about Martin Luther King. They tell you Martin Luther King, he was peaceful. Well, he was peaceful until he wasn't, right? And then that's what, these people don't understand. And I say these people because that's what it is. White people they're not educated. They're not given this.
Well, it's not just white people. It's Black people too.
I agree.
But because it is not taught in school. They go from slavery to, emancipation, to the civil rights movement, to Jim Crow, to the civil rights movement, and everything is great, right?
I don't remember learning about Jim Crow.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, and really, we don't talk a lot about slavery in school. So I'm with you, Darren. You just don't. Where do you learn it? And that's what we were talking about on our first couple of episodes, saying is that we have to put in some extra work outside of what we're just given inherently. We got to put in some extra work.
Well, but it has to be people who how do you tell middle America white people that this happened without scaring the bejeebies out of them? Right? White American people have no idea that the American government dropped bombs on its own people less than 100 years ago.
And they wouldn't believe it. Most wouldn't believe it.
No.
Right. Or they don't know about the Tuskegee experiment. Right.
Yeah.
And so, there's a long list of things that I could talk about in terms of things that Black people have gone through. But, as long as you've got Google and as long as you have a local library to go to, do a little bit of extra work, and maybe you will, you'll find out more or learn a little bit more about what Black people are going through. I mean, I just finished listening to, I'm on Audible, so I'm like a new Audible freak, right?
Oh, me too.
I've read 11 books or heard 11 books in the last 3 months, right? And so one of the pieces that I just finished was The Sword and the Shield, and it talked about the differences between Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King, and what it really boiled down to is before both of them were shot down and killed, they were coming to first of all, they were dealing with world issues, and not strictly just Black issues, and that they were more alike as they got ready to, as they got closer, in age, they became more alike than they were different. And so, we all the time we hear, it's either Malcolm or Martin, right? It's either passive or super aggressive, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that by the time both of them were gunned down, they were more. They still believed in some of the things that they did in their ideologies, but they were more closely aligned in terms of what should be talked about, the Vietnam War and the things that were going on in the world. And I think that for me, not that I hadn't heard it before, but that was just one of the things that I read that it sort of helped me to enhance my knowledge base.
One of the things that I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and I very well may be, but one of the things that I think gets lost in translation to white people is they don't understand the different levels of the systemic racism. So when you talk about the incarceration rate of Black males, right? Essentially what happens is now, there's not the Black male it's not that they don't want to be there. It's not that they're bad dads. It's like that narrative is obviously created by racism and different things. They're locked up somewhere else because of a system that unjustly has done that. So now that male presence isn't even there in some of those communities. It's, the three of us are all, deeply familiar with the hip hop world, and you don't have what we call in that world, those OGs to look at somebody and say, hey, this isn't the way. Right. No, you're causing too many issues. Let's have a chat. Right. So that's not there at all. I don't like that. Obviously has to be a big part of, and it's obviously part of the discussion now of incarceration reform and, those different things. But am I wrong in that assumption? Obviously I'm not a white guy, or I'm not a Black guy, so I only can have certain context.
I would say that you're right in what you're saying, but I also have to look at how this federal government has defunded public schools, and how they have, defunded, mental health facilities, right? And so, they call it the classroom is the pipeline to the jail system, right? And so a kid who has a mental health issue at 10 or 11 years old ultimately ends up in prison versus getting the help that they need, right? They get labeled as a bad kid at 10, continue to be a bad kid at 15, when the reality is that they need some mental health assistance, right? I mean, most of these people that are watching this, they won't understand this, but there was a high school quarterback in Detroit, J. Rue Campbell. He won 2 state championships his freshman and sophomore years in high school. And he had, and I can tell this because I know his family, he had serious mental health issues. And he got into an argument, and his trigger was his dad. And he had a fight with a security guard one day, but it was the day that he had been informed that his dad had been picked up and sent to jail again. And so he slams a security guard at the school on the ground. It ends up on World Star, and they end up sentencing him to a few months in the Wayne County Jail. And then the day after he gets out, he gets into a scuffle with his then girlfriend, and then he has to go back into the jail system. And this is all between his age of 15 and 17, right? And so he eventually gets a second chance. But the reality is that he has some mental health issues that need to be dealt with. And there were a lot of people that overlooked some of his mental health issues because he was a star quarterback. And I think those kinds of issues have to be addressed, as well as the schools being equipped to provide the necessary resources and things that people need in order to be successful.
Absolutely.
So and let me throw a little bit onto that as well. I think the systems that we have in place, and I know somebody's going to get upset with hearing that word system because I know that's a trigger for some people. But I think some of the systems, and going back to Darren said, our school system, I think some of the things that we have set up actually gives some of us some mental health issues and some mental health problems. So I was watching you might have been, what's the day? Tuesday? It might have been Sunday. I was watching a white teacher. This must have been in the 60s because she had the weird glasses on. They were all wearing weird clothes. She was doing an experiment, and you guys can probably YouTube it. And she's doing this experiment, and she tells the kids the first day, all the kids with blue eyes, you're on top. That's the word she used. You're on top. And the kids with brown eyes, any of the eyes, you're on the bottom. And so the kids on top got to eat first. They got to play on the good equipment on the playground, and the brown eyed kids and other kids could not do anything. And what she noticed is that first day is that the blue eyed kids started talking negative about the brown eyed and black eyed kids. Now all these kids are white now. And then when they went to do their schoolwork, she noticed that the blue eyed kids was finishing up projects quicker than the brown eyed kids. So that day went by. And at the end of the day, there were little slurs that the blue-eyed kids were saying to the brown-eyed kids, just for no reason, just because they were on top is what they call it. The second day, they switched around. Now, all of a sudden, the brown-eyed kids were literally flipped the position, the mental position was switched. And then all of a sudden, those kids the previous day who took 4.5 minutes in getting the project done, now they were 3 minutes. And she asked one of the girls, she said, why did you finish earlier today than you did yesterday? And she said, because yesterday, brown eyes wasn't on top. Right. And it was a very, very, very interesting, and this goes more deeper. You should watch it. But what point I'm trying to get through that is that just think about the effect it had on just white kids who are, for lack of better words, always on top. For 2 days, this project went. Think about the black kid who goes through life as a young kid, as a babe, understanding that they're not on top. And then that kid has to go out into a world where he's not on top, and you're like, hey, go make something of yourself. And then there's some kids who have good intentions. They're like, I'm going to go ahead and make it. But then they keep getting hit over the face because, again, they're not on top. I think that has... Matter of fact, I know it has. It has a psyche to the black man, the black woman. Yeah. And there are some of us, like Darren and I, we were able to go to in some cases some private schools. We were able to kind of live in the middle class and kind of somewhat be kind of sheltered.
You both had a solid home life.
Solid home life. You know, it's easier for me to come out and say, you know, I can fight against what I know is against me, but I can fight against it. And I can figure out a way and be ingenious and make myself be successful. But that's not the case. And we talked about DNA several times. That's just not the case for a lot of our Black brothers and sisters.
Was it Jane Elliott? Is that who did the?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Jane,
Yes.
You can YouTube a bunch of her different experiments. And she's an absolute legend when it comes to explaining racism and breaking it down for people. There's a couple hour-long things on YouTube you can see where she does these experiments, and when it clicks for white people that all of a sudden, wait a second, this is how it feels. Like they get upset, they get angry, and it's the same thing that we're talking about of the psychology that happens. So I know, I know you've got to run a little bit earlier than normal here.
But I do have a question for Darren though, and I've been holding it again all session long here. So Darren, the hot topic right now is NASCAR. I know you're on the sports beat.
Right.
What is your thoughts and feelings about what? I mean, this is shocking to me that NASCAR is like not only taking down a Confederate flag, but they're really serious about
yesterday seeing that scene of all the drivers pushing Bubba Wallace's car. I'm gonna tell you right now, there's been different things that have happened, and I'm a sports guy, and it happens in sports. I was 100% at that moment. I said to myself, you know what? This stuff like this makes me proud to be an American.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on it, man?
I mean, I think it's a big deal, primarily because of the constituency of who watches NASCAR. It is not 45-year-old, 50-year-old African-American men who are sitting around watching NASCAR, right? So because of the people who are watching NASCAR, I think it was very important for what has been going on. But I mean, it was the same thing last week when corporations started dealing with Juneteenth. And so, you know, for Black America, people have been dealing with Juneteenth for the last, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? But white corporations decided that they were going to get into the Juneteenth movement.
Does that devalue it, you think?
I won't say it devalues it, but I think it's a lot like the Martin Luther King Day holiday. You have to use it as an opportunity to learn more about that day and what you should do. For me, as an African American man, Juneteenth is not a place. It's not a day that I should really be celebrating. You're celebrating a day.
And that's I guess that's where my question comes from.
Where African Americans were told 2 years later that slavery ended, right? And so, it took them 2 years to get a post mail from, somewhere up north down to Texas. To
Pony Express.
They were free.
Pony Express.
Yeah. Well, it was more like the Snail Express. But I mean, so for me, it's not necessarily a day that should be celebrated. It's a day that should be explored. It's a day for learning. I don't have a problem with that, but it's not, it's kind of like Independence Day has become the day where everyone goes out and they barbecue and all of that kind of stuff, or Memorial Day where you go out and it's just a day off from work and you barbecue, right? And with both of those holidays, Memorial Day is where you're supposed to, deal with our veterans and what they have done for us in the military, right? And so we should celebrate them. Independence Day was a day where some of us were free.
That's it brings a different meaning depending on who you are.
For African American people, we weren't still free, in 1776, and so and I would sort of suggest looking at Juneteenth in the same way, and I just hope that in NASCAR, that what has been done over the last few days is something that is sustainable, and that they begin to align themselves with some Black entrepreneurs or Black people that can help them
So
to ingratiate themselves within the
I
Black
think that's
community.
the next big. I think we're going to have some predominant or, prominent, Black celebrities who have the wealth, who are going to eventually come in. Cause I think Nelly,
Yes.
he has a stake in it. So it's not like it's non-existent, but we don't have the Jay-Z or the people that everybody knows and can look. Michael Jordan's dabbled in different racing and different things. I think that's where it won't. We have to figure out a way to make it mainstream for everybody, and because it's still not an environment that I would feel comfortable going into with 5 Black friends into that
Right.
environment.
But it's also there have been throughout history Black NASCAR drivers who haven't had a chance to perform on the biggest stage, and so this
I think one of the pioneers when it first started was Black. Yeah.
Yes, and so there has to be some sort of movement of being inclusive. They made some headway in terms of Danica Patrick, but they have to find a way to become more inclusive. So take what you have learned over this past couple days or few weeks and make it right, make it sustainable, make it a sort of an equal playing field for people who look like me and who want to be in a NASCAR system.
Absolutely. So Dan, I'm gonna ask you one last question here, and I know AT, if you need to hop off, you hop off if we run a little bit over. But it's one of those things that I want to ask because you're from Detroit, so you're in a different place than AT. It's not for me. For the white people who are listening, or the white people who are watching, who see that there is a problem, and they don't have Black friends per se. And when I say Black friends, I'm not talking about you don't have friends that you cordially hang out with you in your friend group. I'm talking about that you can sit down, that if I call you and say, hey, I'm coming to Detroit and all the hotels are booked up, can I crash on the couch? I know you're going to let me crash on the couch.
Oh, no doubt.
So in this, what do we do? They don't have any people like that I'm blessed to. I truly am blessed, and not just Black people, but people in other countries, other nationalities, all of that. What advice would you give as a Black man that I know beyond any shadow of doubt is open for conversation on how to help them, on what to say, what to deal with, what not to pay attention to, those different things?
Hey guys, I'm gonna run.
All right, take care. I would sort of suggest that you just ask. And that sounds so simple, but you ask and you try to learn. I think there are a lot of people who are out here who will go out and tell you or explain from their perspective what is going on. I don't think it will be anything that for a good portion of people that they won't that they're not willing to discuss some of the problems that are going on in our world. But the one thing that I would say is don't just ask, but to listen. I think in too many situations, there are people who they think they know what they want to hear, but they become defensive when they hear it. And so I think the key is understanding that my experience as someone who is Black is different from someone else's experience.
Absolutely.
And that is okay. It's okay that we have differences. It's okay that we have lived in different places. And I mentioned in the column, I made it very clear, like for me, life was much different as a middle-class kid living in Detroit. But I also understood that life was much different from people that lived in the poorest sections of Detroit, right?
Yeah.
And so, as long as you understand those differences, right? And you are open and willing to listen to what to listen to a different perspective of what someone wants to say from their perspective, then everything will be okay.
Yeah.
Where the problem runs into an issue is when someone Black or of any other nationality
Yeah.
tells you about what's going on, and then someone gets defensive.
Yeah.
And so you have to take a conversation of race, and let's strip away all of our baggage. Let's strip away all of what we think our feelings are, and just have an honest and brutal conversation about it.
Absolutely, because it comes up. I mean, again, I'm very vocal. I put myself out there. I do public speaking. I do, this stuff. So I guess it's part of my job is to be visible and to put myself out there. And when AT and I did the first episode, I got a lot of questions from white friends of mine. Well, why is it like how come they don't, why is it so easy for you to have a conversation or the way you interact? Because for them, it's not natural. It's not like,
right.
Like, there's this thing, I guess, I don't know. Like I don't know. I honestly don't know how to, because I didn't grow up in a predominantly Black city.
Sure.
My grandmother was racist and used the Nword all the time. Like, so it's not like I wasn't the token white guy in, in that wasn't the scenario. So I don't know. And I hate to make it about me, but I only know how to, because when I see racism, I see it exactly for what it is. And I get frustrated when I see white people who don't understand. And I'm in a guy that I've recently become friends with. His name's Cliff Jones. He has a group on Facebook called the Blended Lines, and he's a mixed race individual, and he said it upon him, and he just created this group to bring white people and Black people in to just have questions about what kind of seasoning do you use on the barbecue, all these different things, that there's so many unknowns that and there was a gentleman, actually, I was engaged in a conversation. I got pulled into a conversation right as this was happening, and this individual, clearly from Alabama, very, very, very white. That's the way I'll put it, as a white guy. And his comment was, he says, I've never seen racism, and the people that I know who experience it don't experience it on the regular. So why is this being blown out of proportion? And I think sometimes that is, so my response was, and I haven't been, so I have no idea what I could be getting annihilated right now on a post, but my response was, if it happens once, that's enough. So why does it have to be regular for it to be something that, that's there? And I don't understand, as a white guy, I don't understand. It's confusing to me. Because
but it's all, again, it's all about your perspective. It's all about what you have been living. And so if you have never seen it, or you've never watched, like, now you're in the internet age where everything is seen. It's right before your face, right? But if you've only been watching that for the last 10 years, it doesn't have the same chilling effect as it does for someone like me, who is 49 years old, who has that sort of experience in his life. The way to approach it is, let's strip everything down and let's talk. It's just like a marriage.
Yeah.
When you're in a marriage and you're arguing with your husband or wife, you don't come into trying to have a peaceful conversation, coming in with the baggage that you brought into, you didn't do this in our marriage last week and you didn't do that, right?
Yeah, that's not going to end well.
Because that conversation is not going to go anywhere, right?
No.
And so it's going to be the same thing as you're discussing race. Discuss race the same way that you would sit down and you would discuss it with your spouse.
Yeah.
And you strip all of your negative isms away, and you deal with it at hand, and you try to you know, like a college instructor told me, you listen twice more than you talk.
Yeah.
And the more you listen, the more you'll learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you bring up the internet age, and the whole, and I think, I had, I've had numerous conversations over the last month and a half. Well, they've always been there, but um, with the George Floyd thing, it was brought up. It says, why is this all of a sudden sparking outrage and those things? And it hit me one night, and I don't know if you remember this, right after 9/11, an American soldier was taken hostage and was beheaded, and the video
Yes.
was floating around. Right, that's
Yes.
just the early days of YouTube.
Yep.
And I remember what that video did, and you can actually go and look at the statistics of when that video became to the public.
Yeah.
A spike in people enlisting in the military out of I probably subconscious pride for, hey, I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to see that. So right. In between there, we're talking about obviously two horrendous acts and
sure,
but different. Racism now, I think for a lot of white people, I will say this, that a majority of white people aren't racist, right? They may be, I guess it's that new term of, or the new thinking of, you're either anti-racist or you're racist, right? They're not completely anti-racist because they don't want to make the family dinner uncomfortable when something gets said, or they don't want to disrupt the company get together, or whatever.
Sure.
But I think what happens is we become, as white people, because it doesn't affect us the way it affects you as a black man.
True.
We're numb to it. It's
right.
for most white people, they see it and it's like, well, that didn't affect my night out for dinner. And, it's not like we just got here, but those people have been waiting an hour. I don't even think twice of why the black people are still sitting over there waiting and frustrated that they haven't gotten a seat. So it doesn't affect me because the buzzword that everybody hates is white privilege, right? And it exists. But it's that feel. I think there's a big part of that we're numb to it. So then the George Floyd things happen in a way where, just for whatever reason, psychologically, that triggered people into saying, wait a second. That's different than my uncle making the Nword joke. Right. And now it sparked a new interest.
But also to keep it in context, I do have to believe that some of this is a result of people being at home for 4 months under stay-at-home orders, right? Yes, this has hit people very hard, right? And yes, people wanted to do something about it, but you're talking about millennials who, in a lot of cases, don't want to hear no.
Yeah.
And the COVID-19 situation, the government was telling them you must stay at home to stay alive, right?
Yeah.
And so then when the George Floyd incident occurs, as the country is starting to open up, this gave some people an excuse to be outside.
Yeah.
They could agree with the situation or not, but we have to acknowledge the fact that people of all races, kids of all races, they took to this because this gave them an opportunity to be outside for 4 and 5 hours a day.
Yeah, the weather was nice. It would have been a different story if it had been December.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think we have to, in order to have, a great, context behind it, is that some of it, yes, was about George Floyd. And I won't disagree with that. But what I would add to that is, you're talking about coming off of 4 months of people that were stuck into the house. And for me, my days are pretty normalized because,
Sure.
the only place I would go to is physical therapy 3 days a week. The other
Yep.
2 days a week, I'm at home and doing what I normally do. Now it's kind of like having 5 days a week of doing what I normally know how to do.
Yeah.
So I knew I had a 5-year head start. But for other people, this was their first opportunity to get outside, and it was warm and all this other stuff. And so, you kind of have to use that to keep it in context.
Do you think there's a version of psychology that, and I'm going to use white people, that white people with the lockdown and with the COVID thing, there was a psychological version of oppression in their own way of, I'm being told what to do. I can't do certain things. I'm having to, my liberties are being,
Yes.
stepped on. So do you think maybe subconsciously when this thing became, wait a second, race, and you got Ahmaud Arbery and you've got this guy who's delivering a package and, he's being held and, these different things, all of a sudden it's like, I think there were definitely some white people that were like, wait a second, I don't know what that feels like, but I think I might know what that feels like. And
that's exactly what I'm getting at
yeah,
is you've got a whole bunch of people who have been on solitary confinement for 4 months.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so psychologically, they didn't know what to do or handle it, right? And this is people of all races,
Absolutely.
Including Black people. And so I think this was a very psychological thing that was going on where, literally people were inside solitary confinement for 4 months, right? And so they tell you that being in solitary confinement will drive you crazy, right?
Absolutely.
It's just, instead of being in a, 9-by-8 room or whatever you are, in solitary confinement, you were confined to your home, right? Yeah. But you also have to take into account what kind of home you were in.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So if you're in a dysfunctional home and you have to be in that dysfunctional home day after day, if you live with parents who, where a father abuses the mother every day, where children potentially are getting beat by their parents day after day, or, there's alcohol abuse going on in their homes, or drug problems going on in their homes, there's no way for them to leave and hide from it, right?
Yeah.
And so then the George Floyd incident happens. They can sort of understand what is going on, but this is an opportunity of, this is 5 hours away from my dysfunctional household.
Absolutely.
And I need to get away from my household that's dysfunctional, for 5 days. And so, I think you have to kind of take all of that into account in terms of, people, kind of had PTSD.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And they weren't living in their, they couldn't get out of their homes for 4 months.
Absolutely. And I think that's absolutely a big part of it. So in Detroit, for me in my lifetime, I've never seen as many white people being vocal about race and speaking out. Are you seeing that from a regional or local in Detroit?
Yes. The same thing is happening here in Detroit. Detroit is one of the most segregated areas in the country.
Correct.
So all of the city itself is 80% Black, but the majority of your suburbs are a majority white. Even though in our population loss, Black people started moving to several suburban areas. So with that said, there were a lot of protests with a lot of kids of different races here in Detroit, but there were also several rallies and marches that were held in suburban communities as well. And that included people run by people who were Black, as well as people who were white. And so it's very it's a very interesting dynamic because the police chief here the first night said, if you're going to cause trouble, if you're going to do this here in Detroit, you know, the majority of the incidents happen from people who live in the suburbs, right? In an area that's very, segregated already, right?
Yep.
So what did that do? It was kind of like when Coleman Young said, "Last one out," turn off the lights, or hit 8 Mile Road, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, the folks who would come down to Detroit and participate in those rallies in Detroit, they decided to hold rallies themselves and marches, peaceful protests themselves in a number of suburban communities.
Because Detroit historically has been a hub for the fight of racism and those things throughout history and different historical events and
Oh,
figures
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
those things. And again, I think it's one of those things that I just don't think a large majority of our society knows. And I tell you, one of the things that has always just stood out to me is what I will call the community and pride that the people of Detroit have for the city of Detroit, right?
Yeah.
It's,
Right.
we talk about, we were talking off air about some different instances and some different individuals where that pride, that's where those things come from of,
Right.
you're not going to come here and disrespect what we're working our face off to build and do here. And
Yeah. I mean, but it was also, in 1973 or in 1974, when Coleman Young became the first African American mayor in Detroit. Um, it was right after the '67 riots, when people began to, or continued to leave the city, because um, for a little context, Detroit had 2 million people right around 1950, and by 1980, there was down to 1 million people. Now there's 700,000 people who live in Detroit now, and it'll probably be much lower in the next census, right?
yeah,
And so, what happened as this um, movement was going on? There became a pride of, we have to do it ourselves, because everyone else, for the most part, ran out of the city and said, "You all wanted this city, you take it," right? We were talking about my dad earlier. A part of the reason why he could recruit, the people that he brought in with him to the University of Detroit, and 3 of them were pros, was because he could sell them on, let's do this for our city. This is about Detroit.
yeah,
And it was in 1974, as Coleman Young is coming in as the mayor of Detroit. And so, if you add that context, and it took me a long time to add that context to it, but if you add that context to it, you can understand why Dick Vitale and his assistants were able to come into Detroit, get the best talent out of Detroit, and get them there to where they became a team that ended up being in the Sweet 16. In basketball, when it became a very prominent powerhouse for a 6,000 student campus, right?
yeah.
And so I think that is the things that were going on in Detroit, and that is sort of resonated to this day. It has started to change as Dan Gilbert and others have started to invest in Detroit. But a part of that was a part of that pride, a part of that sensitivity that Detroiters have had. It came from from the '67 riots. It came
Yeah.
from Coleman Young and all of the other incidents that occurred.
Yeah, it's that mentality that's a shirt and clothing line now, the Detroit versus everybody
Absolutely.
mentality. And having been there firsthand and experienced it and seen it, it's just one of those places where you have to if you come in from out of town and you're not from there and you're doing business, you have to check in.
Yeah.
But once you check in and people trust you and you're good, you're treated. I mean, I've never been treated. I was never treated wrong. I was, it was never that. And I know a lot of people who are black, and they're like, man, why are you going to Detroit again? Like, why are you, like, it's not what you think it is, right? Like, it's not. But you got to know the politics and the temperature, and you got to know how to, how to move. But again, for me, it's just one of those things, and I'm glad we've had you on, because I think you're a great contrast and voice for Detroit, obviously. And you're very, there are a lot of things I'm sure that are happening with with this movement that you agree with, and I have no doubt that there are things happening. You're looking at it, you're like, why are we doing that? That's working against the cause, not for the cause. And I know where you stand. So I just want to thank you for coming on. And AT had something come up that he didn't know he was going to have, so he had to dip off. So please don't take that as a disrespectful move.
Not at all.
At all. So I appreciate the friendship, man to man. No matter where we come from, I love you, and you're like family. Your brother's like family. If you're ever down this way, you're ever on I-65 running through, don't hesitate, because we can surely stop. And I got the smoker out back. I got the grill out back. We can get you some barbecue and get you taken care of. And again, I applaud you on the piece. I can only imagine the emotions that went through you, in writing that and having to get that out and put that out. But you did what I have seen Detroit do so many times, is you're able to dig into that deep, dark place and share it in a way to where it really shines the light on it. And truly honored to have you as a friend, and absolutely thrilled that you got to come on here and share your story and share your insight.
And thank you, Shane. I appreciate it. I appreciate our friendship, and all the things that you said. Same thing is, when you come back up to the 313, our houses are open to you as well.
I appreciate that. Well, the D is a place. I'm Pizza Popular. I know there's a lot of different. I know there's a lot of arguments over pizza and who's got the best, and Jets and this, and there's some mom and pops. Pizza Popular was the very first. He's actually an engineer who was engineering at Effigy Studios. He took me down to Greektown, and I went down to Pizza Popular, and I was hooked. I'm hooked ever since. I've had it. There's even a service where you can get Detroit. It's called Gold Belly, and you can have Detroit pizza from a couple different Detroit places. Mailed
they can send it to you.
So I've done it a couple of times. I've got nothing but love for the city of Detroit and all the people there. It's always been welcoming, and it's always made me feel welcome. And I appreciate everyone there who may be listening, who maybe does know me from. I've spent time when you're talking about the segregation. I think it's hard for people who there's literally parts of town to where the railroad tracks split white and black. And I'm not talking about good and bad. I'm talking about one side of the railroad tracks is horrible and it's run down and it's economically, and literally on the opposite side of the railroad tracks, it's nice.
I mean, that's what 8 Mile Road is. If you ever watch the Eminem movie 8 Mile, the symbolism with all of that is that 8 Mile Road literally divides the city and the suburbs, right? And so, for me, I live in Southfield, but I am 3 miles from Detroit. I live right on 11 Mile Road. I can get on one street and get to 8 Mile Road within 2 minutes, right? And that's that is what separates, in some cases, black from white. And so it very much is a metaphor for, meaning the movie. It really was a metaphor of the divide between white and black, because it is very, very real. And when you're talking about the issues that we're talking about, if you're driving on one side of 8 Mile, you're policed by the Detroit police. If you drive on the other side of 8 Mile, if you're going west on 8 Mile, you are policed by the suburban communities
Yep.
and suburban cops. And so, you know, you can literally be, you know, again, on 8 Mile Road and the Detroit police are not looking at anybody. And you can literally look from your window and see 4 teenagers from Detroit sitting on, you know, the ground with handcuffs behind them as the police are rummaging through their car.
While
And so,
white people on the other side are seeing it and just shopping and doing their thing. It's
right.
It's
Yeah.
the craziest. It literally
Right.
was unbelievably eye-opening for me. And some of the best, you know, a lot of people hear about different neighborhoods. Some of the nicest people that I met were on Runyon Avenue. We're on 8 Mile,
Yeah.
9 Mile.
Yeah.
Like I know about Detroit. I know where it's at. And these people,
Yeah.
they didn't look at me any different once they got to know me. And it was this, you know, it's a beautiful place. Detroit
Yeah.
is. I love everything about it. Beautiful baseball park there.
Yeah, absolutely.
You guys got it, man. We'd love to have you on again later down the road at some point.
Likewise. Anytime.
Appreciate everything. Next time you see your
Likewise.
brother, tell him I said hi.
I
And
certainly will.
thanks for everything, Darren.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right. Cheers, buddy.
Yep. We'll talk soon.